Well, we have gotten large, sweeping changes to the balance tuning for 10.2. Many specs have been targeted. We have some significant and important buffs, as well as some nasty nerfs coming our way in this new build of the PTR. So let's not waste too much time and start immediately with the first change, the first relevant change in the PTR, which is for Blood Death Knight. Blood has a little bit of a quality of life change to its tier set. The 2-piece set bonus now triggers from consuming runic power. Previously, this was procced by consuming a bone shield charge. Now, this is a quality of life improvement primarily for the raid. You know, when you are not the main tank, therefore you're not being slapped by the boss, therefore you're not consuming bone shield charges, this wasn't going to work. This was going to do nothing. Now, though, even when you are off tanking, you can still benefit from the 2-piece because you're spending runic power anyways, even if you're not the main tank. Meanwhile, for Frost Decay, there isn't really as much of a major change, rather just a nerf. Now, the set bonus has a 30% chance to trigger instead of 40, and the cooldown reduction of Empire Rune Weapon is now 6 instead of 10. We are summarily skipping Havoc Demon Hunter because they have just received their first implementation of the so-called rework, which is quite a long list of changes. They do have quite some interesting additions to the spec, in particular getting a Fel version of Breath of Sindragosa by having Fel Barrage turn into a Fury draining AoE ability, as well as the massive amount of extra talent points you now have, because now 7 different talents have been reduced in the amount of talent points they cost. So in a scenario where you are going to take all 7 of these, you now have in the next patch 7 more talent points to spend elsewhere, which is going to free up a lot of the freedom in your build variety as a Havoc Demon Hunter. Then we have one of our first significant changes, which is Guardian Druid. Guardian Druid receives both a massive nerf but also a massive buff. Now, the massive nerf in question to Guardian Druid is that Thrash Rage generation from Blood Frenzy now has a target cap. Blood Frenzy is the very helpful talent which gave you 2 rage whenever you hit an enemy with Thrash, and it was uncapped, which means the Guardian tank could pull 20 mobs, use Incarnation, and then gain basically 40 rage whenever he thrashed. This allowed you to spam Iron Fur while you were spamming Thrash, gain a massive Absorb Shield, and be immortal. Now, this is capped at just 5 enemies, meaning at the very best, this rage regen will be capped at 10 extra rage per Thrash cast, which is a massive nerf to the AoE tankiness of Guardian Druid every time you go above 5 targets. The counter to this is the huge buff to the 2-piece set bonus. Dream Thorns now absorbs 25% of the damage dealt, while active instead of 10%, and the duration is now 45 seconds. If you go to their current tier set, 20% of the damage you did during Rage of the Sleep is going to fuel the Dream Thorns, and after Rage of the Sleeper expires, you absorb 10% of the damage dealt. Now it's gonna be 25%, and it's gonna be 45 seconds. So the defensiveness, the defensive buff that you gain with this 2-piece change is very, very large. However, this will not make up for the size of this nerf, both in terms of damage, but also more importantly in terms of defensiveness. To the point where Guardian Druid are starting to think whether or not it's even worth to continue running Ursoc's Fury, because now the Absorb Shield generated by Thrash will be far, far lower after this nerf. Very, very small changes instead to Restoration Druid, only just a tiny addition by having Scenarios Guidance reducing the cooldown of Incarnation by 5 seconds when a Grove Guardians phase instead of 4. So very, very tiny, not really worth mentioning. Then we go to another set of important changes, at the very least in name only, which are the ones to Augmentation. What a surprise, Augmentation continues to be nerfed. Aspect's Favor, which is the max HP passive, has been further nerfed down to 2 to 4%. It was at 5 to 10% on release, nerfed to 3 to 6, and now it's been nerfed to 2 to 4%. Molten Blood absorption has been reduced by 50%. Ebon Might, of course, more importantly, Might grants 8% of the evoker's primary stat instead of 10%. Now, obviously, none of this matters. Obviously, augmentation is still primed to be an S tier spec in 10.2. The main problem, especially for Mythic Plus, is that none of these nerfs matter as long as the stat buff is given to tanks and healers. That is really just that simple. As long as you keep being able to be the only DPS spec able to give 10 to 15% stronger healing to your healer and 15 to 20% stronger tankiness to your tank as a DPS, you will continue to be the premier DPS pick in Mythic Plus because of how much more powerful you can make the DPS and the tank in your group. In the raid, it loses some value compared to Mythic Plus, but it still looks like it will be a relevant spec overall in the raid as well. Once again, completely unsurprisingly, Blizzard continues to have problem managing to deal with this new addition of the first support spec in the game. And then, to finish Evoker still not on a good note, Preservation gets further nerfs. First of all, the initial planned buff to Spirit Bloom by 25% is removed. Now, it's a big nerf because your current 2-piece is already buffing a Spirit Bloom by 15%, so now you're losing a massive amount of healing of Spirit Bloom. And on top of that, as we talked about Blizzard's wanting to nerf powerful raid cooldowns, Rewind now recovers 33% of the damage taken instead of 40%. So we continue down the line of nerfing strong healer cooldowns. Then we have a buff, which is also a quality of life change to Arcane. The current version of the Arcane set bonus made you gain an empowered Arcane missile turning into an AoE Arcane missile firing at nearby enemies after you consume 6 clear casting charges for a 75% damage increase. Now you only require to consume 3 clear casting stacks instead of 6, and the damage increase is not 75%, it's 150, so twice as much on the primary target and then 100% more on the secondary hits. So it's been buffed across the board. Even the duration, the buff duration of consuming clear casting stacks has been increased. So 2-piece buffed in duration and then 4-piece buffed in how quickly you can proc it as well as the damage proc of the set. So buffs across the board for Arcane. Even further buffs to Fire Mage. Now the critical strike damage is gonna be 4% per stack instead of 3, and the 4-piece set bonus increases your critical strike damage by 150% instead of 100. So previously you could stack this up to 15%. Now you can stack it up to 20%, and then when you activate the 4-piece, the 15% doesn't become 30% more critical strike damage, but the now 20% critical strike damage will become 50% more critical strike damage. So this reads, activating Combustion gives you 50% more damage. That is what this is gonna read now as a Mage. This will make it stronger by quite a bit compared to your current set as Fire. Also, the only thing that was making this tier looks somewhat mid compared to what you have right now was this bug. The fact that Ignite wasn't being attributed to the damage of the critical strikes. Now Blizzard is pointing out that this issue will be resolved in the next PTR build. So this tier set will now be properly powerful in the PTR. There is a buff and a question mark change to Mistweaver. The 2-piece set bonus, very simple buff. Chi Harmony now stores 20% of all healing instead of 15%. That's just a positive one. And then there is the question mark one. Healing Elixir has been redesigned to be a passive effect. Now you're going to be automatically consuming the Elixir when you drop below 35% HP, instantly healing you for 15% of your max HP. You get one of this charge every 30 seconds. Now, as I said, it's a question mark change because it's obviously a buff for very quick and dangerous situations. This will not even cost you a global cooldown. It will happen automatically. It has a very similar effect to other similar things like Nature's Guardian auto heal for a Shaman, for example, but you now also lose control over it. For example, what if you are at 50% HP and a massive boss ability is about to hit and is about to one-shot you and you need to heal yourself? Previously, you could just chunk Healing Elixir even at 50% HP to put yourself at a safe level of health. Now you can't anymore because this procs by itself at 35%. That's why it could be both good or bad, depending on which situation you might have been in. But it definitely gives more stable durability, survivability as a Mistweaver Monk. We then have a couple of quality of life changes to the Windwalker set. Now Blackout Kick damage is increased by 150% instead of 100, and more importantly, the 4-piece set bonus. The cooldown reduction is now 2 seconds instead of 1. The Windwalker is the tier which had the RNG effect to give you Ebon Toes to increase the damage of your next Blackout Kick, and then when you consumed it, you reduce the cooldown of your other abilities by 1 second. Now it's 2. You know, the tier is still somewhat bad. It's still also, as always, when it comes to Windwalker, in many things tied to RNG. The damage increase to this ability is not that worthwhile. At the very least, it's good that it's being buffed across the board, even though very often making something bad more often won't really make it that much better. At the very least, it's a start. Surprisingly, we talked a few days ago about the OP-ness of the Brewmaster set, and in Monk, for now, Blizzard see nothing wrong when it comes to Brewmaster and keeps it in that state. On to a series of changes, mostly nerfs again. Seems like we're talking about this for the 7th time in a row, to Holy Paladin. Even more healing nerfed, 3% apparently wasn't enough, we are now up to 5% healing nerf. A bit of a nerf to your cooldown Hand of Divinity to increase the next couple of Holy Lights healing by 40% instead of 80. Buffed on the Absorb Shield proc to targets when they drop to low HP, Saved by the Light, increased by 50%. Now it's a pretty good safety measure of a talent. Also buffs to Glimmer, Blessed Focus now increases the healing of Glimmer by 40% instead of 25%, and buff to the overall healing of Merciful Aura, 15%, but nerf to the healing of Merciful Aura when it is active. Then you get Touch of Light buffed, Word of Glory buffed, Barrier of Fate now creates an Absorb Shield based on 25% of the healing instead of 50%, and more importantly, Aura Mastery now gets a nerf. Devotion Aura now gives you 12% damage reduction in Aura Mastery instead of 15%. This overall will net out to be a slight nerf to Holy Paladin, as we have been talking about basically for months now. Ever since Holy Paladin has been reworked, they have received slow trickle-down nerfs over time. We have then a quality of life change to Protection Paladin. The 2-piece set bonus now no longer grants you armor, instead grants you damage reduction. Even better, the maximum stacks have now been reduced to 5 instead of 10, granting you 2% damage reduction per stack instead of 1% armor per stack. So now you can get up to 10% damage reduction quite quickly. It is still somewhat bad and annoying since this tier set is all centered around staying inside this empowered consecration, which is not a very fun playstyle. There is instead an overall set of nerfs to Red Paladin, which is somewhat expected given how powerful this tier was in the PTR. Now Expurgation deals 30% more damage instead of 50%, but the buff you gain after is gonna splash 50% of the main holy damage up to 4 nearby enemies instead of 20, so that's an increase. The 4-piece set bonus gets a nerf where Echoes of Wrath now causes your next 2 spenders to deal damage a second time at 25% effectiveness instead of 50%. Overall, this was expected given the power of Ret currently in the PTR. We then have a series of changes to the 2 healing priests. First, in the general tree, you have the change to Power Word Life. Now, Power Word Life will no longer have the cooldown reduction if you cast it on a target below 35% HP. Now it's always only usable on targets below 35% HP, but now the base cooldown is 15 seconds instead of 30. A few positive buffs around Discipline, mainly about 15% more damage and healing of Penance, as well as the buff of Will and Woe to give you more smite damage and Power Shield power. Nothing really too drastic for Discipline, also no changes to the tier set. Same goes for Holy Priest, which gets no changes to the tier set itself, but surprisingly gets flat out healing nerfs. Prayer of Mending gets its healing decreased by 5%, Prismatic Echoes reduces the increase in healing of Echo of Light. Echo of Light itself has a massive healing nerf. This is very important because your mastery was your strongest point as a Holy Priest, so this nerf right here is very hurtful to your overall HPS. That's the main noticeable change when it comes to Holy Priest. A few small changes to the rogue specs still undergoing their rework. So far, nothing really to notice other than looking into Outlaw, which is currently the most OP of the specs in the PTR. Only one nerf. Crackshot damage with the dispatch is reduced by 75% of normal damage instead of 100. This is still nowhere near enough to make the spec any less OP than it currently is. Even this is not even as bad since Dreadblaze wasn't even used in Mythic Plus. Yes, it was used a bit more in the Raid compared to Mythic Plus, but still, overall these nerfs are not that terrible for Outlaw considering the current power they have. Then you have Elemental, who has a rework to the 4-piece set bonus, turning into a meatball machine gun. After using Primordial Wave, for 10 seconds after, your Chain Lightning will cause your next Lava Burst to hit up to 3 additional targets affected by your Flame Shock. So basically, Lava Burst Cleave effect whenever you activate Primordial Wave. Which is a pretty cool, a pretty nice effect for Elemental, finally trying to put more power into their fire build, into their lava burst side build, rather than going still down the line of the lightning build, which Elemental has used for a while. Some, I guess, necessary changes to Resto Shaman and their tier set. Tidal Reservoir now heals for 15% of all Riptide healing done instead of 20, but it lasts for longer, which is a good quality of life change. However, the nerfs comes in the 4-piece. The chance to create, the chance to spread like AIDS a new Riptide has been reduced to 5% instead of 10. This was the strongest bit when it came to the Raid. It gave you the ability of Resto Shaman to get to 10, even 15 Riptides out at all times, all over the place because of this Tidal Reservoir effect, having a chance to spread Riptide. Now this is nerfed in half. Meanwhile, for once, we get exactly what we asked with Affliction. If you remember, we said that this tier would have been S tier if actually Seed of Corruption was included, because the 4-piece read that Soul Rot empowered your next 3 Malefic Raptures by doing 50% more damage and extending the duration of your dots by 2 seconds. However, with this change, now we have the increase in the damage of your next Malefic Rapture or your next Seed of Corruption. There you go. Now the 4-piece will correctly buff either your single target or your AoE spender, basically. So now this is a proper good set for both situations of damage profile. What is instead weird is Demonology. Demonology continues to go down a rabbit hole of just weird changes, completely overhauling how the spec works. Yes, technically, they all read like massive buffs if you read this. Look at this, it's just flat out 30 to 25% buffs to most of their abilities. Unfortunately, what also gets nerfed are features like their major cooldown, which were used to do massive burst damage, which is now basically gone completely. Essentially now, the dream of the dev seems to turn Demo to have a rotation like this. Shadowbolt, 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 Hand of Gul'dan, Shadowbolt, 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 Hand of Gul'dan, Implosion, rinse and repeat. That's how Demo is planning out to be right now in the PTR, which is quite the depressing outlook for the spec in 10.2. Meanwhile, Destro gets a couple of quality of life changes to the set bonuses and an overall flat increase to their AoE damage, 15% damage buff to Rain of Fire. Destro is still, while not being nearly as bad as Demo, is still in a pretty depressing situation where the rotation can basically be played blindfolded with 3 buttons, so it's not really that exciting either. Small but significant changes instead for our last class, which is Warrior. Number 1, they get somewhat of an aura mastery treatment like Paladin had. Rallying Cry now increases your max HP by 10 instead of 15%. This is the same as basically all of the other major raid cooldowns. It's a bit sad that this is also made weaker in party content, considering the little amount of utility effects that Warrior already had, and now one of the few ones that was actually powerful gets nerfed. That's a bit unfortunate. absolute terror in the eyes of Arms Warriors when Blizzard changes Slam to do 25% more damage. We talked about the problem. We talked about the problem of Arms having way too much rage to spend, so they were using Ignore Pain to dump that rage, but now Blizzard nerfed it so that Ignore Pain no longer works with your talent, benefiting you from consuming rage, so now Arms Warriors had to find a different ability to dump rage with. Granted, their set bonuses in 10.2 will help them, because now you can get way more procs of sudden death, meaning you can cast way more executes and dump way more rage that way, but it's likely still not enough. So Blizzard is trying to push you towards putting Slam in your bars. I fear this is a lost cause. I don't think Arms Warriors will go and put Slam on their bars anyways. Good quality of life buff to Protection Warrior instead. The main quality of life change is that the 4-piece set bonus when you were consuming a bleed on a target, on top of the damage reduction per bleed consumed, the cooldown of Thunderous Roar was reduced by 1 second. This was too short. The cooldown itself is already too small for Thunderous Roar, that you can use it basically every pull, but now you have the set bonus reducing the cooldown of Thunderous Roar by 3 seconds instead of 1. Now this will make it more special. Now you can probably go from using Thunderous Roar once per pull to using it twice, and then once, and then twice, and then once, and then twice. So at the very least, it can have a visible effect on your abilities to use every pull by giving a much reduced cooldown to Thunderous Roar. Also, good quality of life change to the 2-piece. Right now, the 2-piece applies a debuff on the enemy to do less damage to you. Instead now, consuming bleeds now grants a damage taken reduction to the warrior instead, which is much better, because now it's always on you. Doesn't matter if some targets weren't being hit, doesn't matter if some targets didn't get the debuff, now you always get the damage reduction debuff on yourself, which is a good quality of life change to the tier of Protection Warrior in 10.2. So with this, we have the whole list of changes for many of the specs being touched. As I mentioned, we had some significant buffs. In this case, we haven't gone through it in detail, but Demon Hunter Havoc is getting quite some powerful buffs. So we had some also impactful nerfs, like the ones given to Guardian Druid, some less impactful nerf, like the ones given to Augmentation, good quality of life changes left and right to Arcane Mage, to Fire Mage, some less good quality of life changes like Windwalker. So this is what right now Blizzard has in store for the next build of 10.2 in the PTR. So with this whole list of changes, we're going to leave each other on this Thursday. Let me guys know, of course, in the comments, what are your thoughts about all of the changes, in particular about the specs you are currently playing or thinking of playing. And besides this, we are now going to leave each other. We are starting our goodbyes by thanking all of the Patreon supporters for the contribution and help to the growth of the channel, which, as usual, can still be given for free. You can like and comment down below, as well as subscribe to the channel itself. Now, with these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, I finally wake up to some clouds, some chilly temperature. I am almost thinking about putting on long pants. That's the right time of the month.